welcome, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I guess it's good afternoon, actually, officially, at least here. Okay. Thank you all for coming and joining us today. We are going to go ahead and actually just get started. It's right at noon, and I know all of you are super busy. And thank you again for taking time out of your day to join us today. We will be today. Scrum Training Institute is presenting or hosting Navigating Change When Rapidly Remote with Mark Kilby, and we're so pleased to have him as our presenter today. I know you guys are in for a treat. So before I turn it over to him, just want to run through a couple quick housekeeping items. We are on the meeting version of Zoom, so you actually will have to keep your own mute settings, your audio muted, and that would be appreciated. If you do have questions throughout, you can use chat, or Mark has mentioned he's going to give a couple breaks through, intermixed in the presentation to have questions. So we've got a small enough group that we should be able to do well with that. And did want to also mention that this is being recorded. We will be posting a link to the webinar on our YouTube channel, so you will all get an email with that information. And of course, anybody who is not joining us today who signed up will get that email as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's get the screen share going here. And as our lovely hostess said, please feel free to pop things in chat or go ahead and ask questions as we go. I'll leave video optional for this one. If you want to come on video, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too. But I do want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because I've recognized a couple names and I know you're not anywhere near my time zone. So glad to have you here. All right, so let's talk about this topic of navigating change. I'm sure we're all very familiar with that these last few months. A little bit about me and this funny little picture here. My experience spans quite a few years, counting in decades now, as you can tell from the gray hairs. But in my career, I have had the opportunity to work across a number of different industries and government, in both consulting capacities and internal capacities, and I never had, well, I would say rarely had the opportunity to have a completely co-located team. And I suspect some of you are here because you don't have co-located teams, or maybe you're just dealing with other kinds of changes that have made things disruptive. So I've had to deal with that sort of disruption most of my professional career. But also, as I got more active in the Agile community, founding Agile Orlando, the Agile Florida network of user groups, and collaborating on various conferences, I also had remote teams every time. And so the experience I took from volunteering, I took back into my work side of my business. And from the work side of the business, I took into volunteering. And now I'm an independent consultant. My company is K5 Labs. And you'll understand the labs part by the end of the talk. But I would really like to find out a little bit more about all of you. So if you have time to grab another browser window, or if you want to get on your phone or a tablet and enter menti.com and the code 483966, let me know what kind of role you have right now within your organization. So I will also put that in chat. 483966. 66. There you go, Ann. You were ahead of me. So let me know. All right, I see at least one Scrum Master in the group here. What other roles do we have here in the audience? Maybe you're a coach, maybe you're a product owner, maybe you're on a dev team, maybe you're within the leadership of the organization. Okay, there's somebody in a leadership role, or maybe you're in some other capacity. Okay, there's somebody in the other category. All right, give it another few seconds here so more people have a chance to vote. All right. Scrum Master, product owner, leadership coach, and other. All right, so it looks like we have a good mix of roles here. For the next question I have, when did your organization prepare to go remote? Were you already remote before this year? Did your organization prepare to go remote in January or February? Maybe you prepared in early March as things were happening, or as somebody just voted, no, we just got shoved out the door because of what has happened. All right, so there was one that got shoved out the door so far, some that had some prep in March, and that was probably a little rushed. Okay, seems like most of you are in that situation. Okay, a couple that kind of had pushed out the door. Ah, more. Okay, okay, great, great. All right, give it another second there. All right, I am not seeing more. So I'm going to move on to this next, and I think is probably the most important question about these last 3 months. Did you feel like this while the last 3 months were happening? So give me a thumbs up if you did, or a thumbs down that you felt differently. All right, a little bit of a mix so far, 3 and 3. Some felt like that. Some feel maybe not. It was something different. All right, thank you for that. All right, let me switch gears now back to the presentation. I'll leave that poll up if you want to keep voting. So this talk is going to help hopefully frame the conversation around change and navigating change and helping others in your organization deal with that. And like I said before, feel free to ask questions anytime in chat. I'm very used to kind of watching chat while I'm talking. Family, pets, background noises are welcome, and I appreciate that you've all muted, but don't feel you have to stay muted. But as we work remote, we're always bringing part of the meeting with us because we are working from home these days. So I'm accustomed to that. It does not bother me. All right. So our path today is we're going to talk a little bit about mindset shifts, or I might just say mind shifts to make it easy. We're going to talk about, in the context of those mind shifts, what are 3 disciplines for leading distributed teams? And then we're going to talk about experimenting to explore mind shifts. All right. Hopefully that will work for us. So let's talk about what is a mind shift. So one of my very first experiences with this was when my wife and I took a vacation to United Kingdom. We were there for a week. We had a lovely time. On the very last day, we had a very busy day, and then jumped in the car to go back to the hotel, and there was a slight problem. This picture might tell you what that problem is. Can you tell? Oh, maybe the screen is not being shared. Thank you for that. Zoom is being challenging. Hold on.
We see a road now, Mark.
Ah, thank you. That's all right. So from this picture, what can you tell might be the problem if I'm driving in the United Kingdom?
You're going on the wrong side of the road.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yep. And Danielle got it too. So because I was tired, we had dealt with a lot. I went with my best practice in the US. But as some of us have learned, best practices only work in certain contexts. And we've got to be very careful about applying those when we shift into a new context, like going from in the office to remote, or some of the challenges we have now around the discrimination conversations we have now. There's a new awareness. There's a new context around that particular change. So we've got to be careful, because in that wrong context, best practices can be harmful, and we may not even realize it. So we have to stay aware of the impact of the change to ourselves as well as to others that we work with. So let's talk about another example, time zones. And one of my early uh, discoveries as I started working with time zones were, are they really the problem? And the answer that I found was not really. It's more, do we have enough hours of overlap when we are remote that we can successfully collaborate as a team? So here in this example, we've got 4 people in one location, 2 in another, and then Polly, who happened to be the product owner for this particular team, was in a 3rd location. Dave had some management responsibilities, and so he was pulled off on another team for a couple of hours each day. We had some team members that would come in early, some that would come in later, some that would take very short lunches, some would take longer lunches, and Polly would block all of her customer calls in one part of the day, thinking that would be the best way to, or the least impactful for the team. But notice the only times the team was 100% available to each other were only for 3 hours, 2 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. So really trying to get the entire team together was very challenging. One of the things, or another thing you might notice, is they were all in the same time zone, as probably many of you are now with your colleagues. Yes, you're remote, but you're in the same time zone, and you think, oh, we should have at least 8 hours of time together. These people did not, because of different things pulling them away. And now that we're working at home, you have other changes that are impacting you. Maybe you have children at home. Maybe you have sick family members at home. Hopefully not, but I have known those that had. And so that also pulls them away. So what if Polly had a sick family member? And what if Dave had children that would pull them away from the team at different times during this period? So what this team did is they looked at, can we shift some of our hours? And so what Dave did in his particular case, he took some of the meetings and asked if other team members could potentially sit in, and he was able to push those to a different part of the day. Also, Polly spread out her calls, and she was able to provide more availability to the team. So with some of that shifting that happened, they now have 4 hours each day where they could collaborate. They probably could have done more, but they found it enough to set up particular meetings. So if they could find time for a stand-up meeting, they could find time to plan, they could find time to review the work and have a retrospective on how is everything going with the team and what else might we change. So when Johanna Rothman and I wrote our book on distributed teams, we found that 4 hours is sort of a minimum for distributed teams in particular. So it wasn't so much their time zone differences. It was more, can they find 4 hours of overlap? This is what allowed the teams to really work well as agile teams. So two mind shifts here were team hours over office hours were a big shift for these team members and the management. So rather than imposing office hours, let the teams decide. And that was a second big shift, is giving teams as much choice as possible over how they controlled their space, their virtual workspace, their space within time as well. So let's talk about three disciplines in particular to help us navigate those kinds of mind shifts. So the first is managing change through experiments. The second is amplifying the communication and collaboration both within the team and really across the organization. And also focusing on principles over practices, because practices are usually tied to a particular context. So for those of you who have ever been up at 4 a.m. for a stand-up call, you realize that practice may not work so well for everybody, even if you have hours of overlap. So let's talk about managing change through experiments. So let's say we have a team, works together well, and their performance it goes up and down, but it tends to average out over time. And then some kind of change is introduced. It could be a new process, a new team member, new tools. Maybe there's a new conflict within the team, or there's an urgent request, or maybe one of these new tools failed in some way that the team couldn't work. It might have blocked the entire team. Or somebody was out sick. That's probably a more relevant example these days. And or maybe it was the product owner wasn't available for a long period of time. And so this can disrupt the team in different ways. Now, what's interesting is the expectations around these kind of changes. So if it's a change that we decide to take on, or a change that somebody else thinks is a good idea and strongly suggests the team take on, the expectation is things will get better with this change. When it's a change that's imposed on the team or imposed on us individually, there's the concern of, oh, we're going to struggle with this. It's going to be really hard, and our performance is just going to go down to zero or worse even. So question I have for you, and go ahead and answer this in chat, is what caused the change that your teams are experiencing right now? Give me a 1 if you feel it was initiated by somebody in your organization. Give me a 2 if you think it was imposed by outside forces. Give me a 3 if it was both, or give me a 4 if you think it was something else that caused the change. So go ahead and do that in the Zoom chat, please. All right, I'm seeing 3s and 2s. 4, okay, so something else. 3s and 2s. All right, excellent, excellent. So I think that's most everyone there. And it's a little different for everybody. It will never be the same, even within your teams. If you were to do an informal poll like this, you would probably get very different answers on the perception of where the change came from. So what really happens under the right conditions is, oh, thanks, James. Yep, go ahead, keep voting if you didn't get a chance to. When that change happens, there's a little bit of a disruption from that status quo, and the team, or sometimes even particular individuals, will wrestle for a while. There'll be a little bit of a transition as they figure out how to adapt to this. And there might be a new status quo that could be better. It may be the same. It may be a little worse, but it stabilizes over time. So to kind of smooth out that curve a little bit and to show the stages, we've got the old status quo. We have where the change is introduced and is actually challenging some assumptions we have. We then kind of resist how those assumptions are challenged, and we really try to hold on to those assumptions. Probably a lot of this felt this in March as we had to work from home. But then we start to do some unlearning. We start to let go of those assumptions, and we will kind of wrestle with, okay, what is the new way that I need to think about this issue? And it'll be disruptive for a while. I'm sure we've all felt that recently. But then there's some idea. You either get it from somewhere else, or maybe you think, oh, you know what, we should try to do X, whatever X is. And there might be some struggles with whatever X is, but then there might be some other ideas. And eventually the team kind of starts coming together. They start seeing, okay, there's a way to make this work, as they start integrating the learning around these ideas they're trying out, that they're experimenting with. And that's when they eventually level out into that new status quo. But I did say something about under the right conditions. So we'll talk about those right conditions actually in the last part of the talk, but it's really through experimentation. So I'm going to pause to see if anyone has questions right now. And you can get off mute if you have a question, or you can type one in chat. All right, not seeing any yet. All right, then I will move on. Let's talk about that second mindset shift, that discipline around amplifying communication and collaboration. So some believe this is the way to work. So not only having the headphones on that block out everything else, but we even want the visor. We want the whole virtual reality experience. However, what happens really is when we have remote, and particularly in some of the hybrid situations some of us were before COVID, you would have a collection of people that would work really well together in one location. You might have some remote people in other locations, and there would not be an equal collaboration. As indicated by this solid circle here, the people who all work in one location, they have many ways to communicate and collaborate. And so there's a closeness, there's a greater affinity with that group. And the dotted line, the dotted circle actually, really shows a looser or weaker affinity with the whole group. And those people outside that main location feel isolated. They feel left out. They miss conversations. And eventually those people will end up doing something else. They will end up moving on to other places or other projects because they get frustrated. They want to be part of the team. They want to be useful. What I found is, as we worked remotely, and even with this shift due to COVID, is that closer affinity still initially stayed for those who worked together. But if there were some remote participants, we started to see that that affinity within those people that were working closely together, that would start to fade a little bit. And the overall team affinity would become stronger, mostly because they were all on a more equal set of communication. They all had to communicate as we are now. Some were more comfortable with this than others. They were all kind of going through that curve, that change curve, in different times and in different ways. But there was a more equal or more balanced way. And anytime I've worked with a remote team, it's about weakening that location-based communication and really focusing on a complete set of communication and amplifying communication across the organization. So you've probably heard things such as, if one person's remote, everybody on the team should work as if they are remote. So avoiding things like conference room meetings that isolates some of those external people is just one of many techniques there. But this is really the situation we have now. This is what we would refer to in our book as a nebula. So the nebula team, they're completely out in space as we are now. So everyone has that very equal set of communication, and there's a very strong team affinity. So I've worked with teams that for many years have worked this way and have worked just as well as location-based teams. Now, I'm not going to say that distributed is better than being co-located. It depends on the context, I found. Okay. But how can we build that affiliation within our remote teams? Well, we've already talked about hours of overlap. Another thing is having that dedicated team back channel. And our Zoom chat is somewhat like that now. So having that channel, that's another way for you to communicate with me and with our hosts while we're going through this presentation. But what happens if the meeting goes down? We lose that chat channel. So most teams will use their normal chat tool. So let's say it's Slack. Let's say um, it's well, Microsoft Teams is a little bit different how they approach the meetings and chat. But having that external channel so that if the meeting software goes down, you still have chat to communicate and coordinate. So teams, remote teams that I've worked with have been able to quickly deal with any kind of technical issues and shift from one meeting space to another. Let's say Zoom to Google Meet or Google Meet to WebEx. And I've seen teams make that shift in under a minute that have those tools available to them and that back channel to coordinate. Another thing is that back channel helps the team kind of keep a running set of questions and notes because maybe not everybody can break in on the audio conversation or maybe they don't feel they can. So that back channel allows them to ask questions, make other comments, and it almost becomes a running set of notes. And if it's kept in an external chat tool, that does become part of the team's notes. And they can query that anytime if they have to go back and refer to that. Some other systems would be forms of what you might have heard as pairing and mobbing. So that usually refers to development, but the concepts of pairing and mobbing also work in just any kind of teamwork. So with the buddy system, if you have some people that are new to the team and some people that are more senior to the team, you might have them buddy up to get them comfortable with maybe how to use a new meeting tool or a new chat tool, or how to learn to work on the code or whatever the particular project is. So the buddy system is one way for team members to keep together. The co-pilot situation is more where you have co-facilitators, for instance, in a meeting. This is sometimes referred to as an ambassador model as well, where you have people that are take a leadership role in the teams and particularly in the meetings, and they can help kind of keep an eye on how is their part of the team doing, especially if they were previously in certain locations and they understand the mannerisms or the language maybe that's used in chat for those other team members. And they can kind of say, you know, I'm sensing some concern from my group. Let's slow down on this part and talk about it some more. So it's important for that co-pilot model to work that we go to this fourth one, which is know the whole person. So it's not just conversations about work, but as we work remotely, it's allowing teams to actually talk about their home life. So certainly I am not on a beach right now. And there are times where my teammates, as you can see now, get to see the messy office, and they will meet my family just as if my family had walked through the physical office. So don't always be concerned about family members coming in. Share some of that. Allow people to get to know your home context, because that is now where you work. And so they'll now better understand when you have a sick family member or if you have to take care of a child. If they have met those people in your home, it gives an opportunity for them to realize, oh, we should probably talk about what happens if you have to go help with those. And that helps with those hours of overlap conversation in particular. Now, as we're starting to reopen, this is where the fifth bullet comes in. And I did this many times pre-COVID with remote teams, but that ability to bring everyone together. So people not only learn to coordinate and understand the big picture of the work, but also have an opportunity to get to know each other in a social setting. So that socialization for remote teams is important, just as important in person as well as online. So these are ways to help build that affinity as we work remotely. So I'll pause here and see if anybody has any questions. Going once, going twice. All right, on we go. All right, now let's talk about this last one, focusing on principles over practices. Oh, social discussions. I'm sorry, I just saw that. Can you elaborate on what about social discussions?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, I'll put the microphone on now. So I'm thinking about if you're co-located, you do this social bonding also, that for instance,
Mhm.
somebody's going to buy a house, does somebody know a real estate agent and so on? And that kind of bonds the team, that you get to know each other
Yep.
when you sit together, and it gets harder when you're distributed.
It gets harder because we have to be more deliberate about the socialization. So some teams will do this in like their normal chat channel. I've done it in and around team meetings where I'll say something like, "Hey, I'm going to be on 10 minutes early for each stand up," and team members will usually ask me, "Well, why?" I said, just to hang out. And some will appreciate that and jump on early just to do some of that socialization. Other teams don't want their work channel confused with socialization, and so they might have a team or even an organization wide uh, sort of water cooler channel. So I've seen it called various things, water cooler, break time, the lounge. And I've even seen some teams that have taken this further to special interests, which were, it could be something like computer languages, but it might be uh, do-it-yourself home repairs and motorcycles and board games and video games. Because if you start a board games group, you've got to have a video games group. I'll just say that pops up automatically. But it allows people to socialize and connect with each other. And there's actually business value to that if we do that across the organization. What I found is when you set up those other channels for people to socialize, as as teams maybe shut down and reform, you might have met some of your future team members in those socialization channels, just as if in a physical location you would have met them in a break room or some social activity sponsored by the company. So it allows people to get to know each other across the organization even. And so I highly encourage that. So I see James has another one here, not a question, but observation. That is now become more acceptable to see family in the background. Yes, right. Because before it was not considered professional. Yes, definitely. I'm sure many of you have seen that one, I think it was a BBC broadcast where the guy's in his suit and then his little, looked like 3-year-old came dancing in the background. And he got very upset with that. And you saw where I don't know if it was wife or nanny or whatever was trying to dive after the child. It's pretty funny video, but you shouldn't be concerned about that because you are bringing part of that space with you every meeting. Now, certainly if you're dealing with customers or a more formal situation, no. But if you're dealing with your teammates, why not? If and it's gonna be a conversation with your team on what they find acceptable. So I'll just put that out there. All right, thanks for those. Let me go ahead and move on. So let's talk about focus on principles over practices. Now, I'm assuming most people here are Agile practitioners. You may or may not be, but every Agile framework has some sort of uh, set of values. So we have the Agile Manifesto, which many people are familiar with. Scrum has its set of values. XP, if people remember those, extreme programming has a set of values. Lean software principles as well. And these all end up percolating down into different practices to support these principles and values. I'm sorry, I just seen the comment here from Ann. I feel seeing family and surroundings has brought a new commonality to all members of our team. Right. So tying it into here, Uh, the having values of openness and respect, that also goes into your team space and your personal space. What do you respect about what you bring in to there? So I'm going to pause on those comments so I can get through this section though. So all of these values and principles end up being derived into practices that many of us are familiar with. So stand-ups, retrospectives, scrum of scrums, pair programming, there's a bunch of them. In the book that Johanna Rothman and I wrote about distributed agile teams, we boiled those different principles down to these 8. And I'm not going to cover all 8 of them, but you see acceptable hours of overlap. We already talked about those. As you read through some of these others around transparency, culture of improvement, creating a rhythm, good intention, a lot of these would apply to a co-located team just as well as a remote team. And the question is, do some of these practices still apply? It depends. It depends on the situation of the team. It depends on how that situation has changed. So I'll just give you one short story here because we're getting close on time. I had one team that they were a Kanban team. They integrated many different packages, software packages. So they not only integrated different systems within their own product line, but a lot of partner systems. And with that, they had many changes. They had many things to keep up with. And they found it hard in their retrospectives to remember everything that they dealt with, even in a 2-week period. It was too much for them to keep track of. And what they noticed is they would try to talk about these after their normal stand-ups. And they said, what if we changed these 2 practices a little bit? So what they did, they happen to be using Slack. So from their separate team channel, they split off another channel, which they called the Kaizen channel, small change channel. So they would just post things that they thought, hey, the team should talk about this. So it became sort of a running list. And there would be some conversation in chat. But what they really wanted to do was have more of a face-to-face conversation. So when they had their stand-ups, and particularly once a week, they would reserve some time toward the end of this particular stand-up. I think it was on Tuesdays, actually. I think it was every Tuesday. They would look at that list and have a 5-minute conversation per topic. If they couldn't resolve it in 5 minutes, that was a signal that, oh, we should talk about this in the retrospective. It's a bigger conversation. It was a very short fix though. Somebody say, oh, I can fix that today. They made a ton of improvements in a very short period of time. And so every week they would make many of these little micro changes to kind of get them to that new status quo, and use the retrospectives for the bigger conversations and setting up some bigger experiments. So this resulted in them handling a large amount of change in a short amount of time by having that short cycle of kind of inspecting on what was happening and figuring out how they were going to change things or at least experiment with them, and then the longer cycle around the retrospective as well. So let's talk about experimentation. So as I mentioned, as you kind of get down into this trough, as you're dealing with the change, it does become very chaotic. But one of the best ways to help everyone on the team handle that is through experiments. However, when the change is large, and we've all had to deal with large changes these last few months, you might feel that sometimes your productivity has just gone below zero. You feel like it's been completely chaotic at times. Maybe you've come out of it. Maybe you or your team feel like, we're not really out of this yet. I just want to get back in the office. I want to shift back to the status quo. Well, you might, but the context is still going to be different. There's still going to be change there. But we've got to be careful also about imposing these large changes. So I've seen this happen also with large transformations in organizations where some do okay, but some go further into chaos, and sometimes the change takes much, much longer if it ever even happens and the team is able to navigate it. So try to look for those smaller changes or how you can break them down like that team I just told you about? How can you make those small changes and space out the larger changes? Sometimes, though, we get ambitious and we say, okay, I've got some small changes. I'm going to make them like every few days. That might not work either. You need to space it out so that everyone on the team has a chance to navigate that change curve. Because here's another thing is we all navigate that change curve at a different rate. You can't assume the whole team is going through that curve at the same time, the same way. So you've got to space out the changes. So what are those right conditions to make that happen? Well, by setting up experiments and really having conversations about what is it we think will is the change that will work, or what do we think is the problem that we need to examine? What's a time box that we want to set around this, and what is the one or two things we want to tweak? We don't want to change a bunch of things. We want to change a few things, and we want to be explicit in what it is we're going to pay attention to and what things we're not going to change. We're going to keep the same to see how our controlled change will make a difference. And what are we going to measure as part of that to see if the change took place? Is it burn down charge? Is it cycle time? You just have to have agreement on what are we going to pay attention to as a group. And then once that time box is up, what did the data tell you? We've got to have that time to reflect. So this could be done in a retrospective. It might just be done ad hoc because the change might be very significant and the team is not making any progress at all. Their performance curve has gone to zero and they need to try something now. So it's having that conversation with the team. And you might want to put a little formality around this just so it's clear to everyone what is the experiment and who's involved and why. So being a little bit more clear on the hypothesis, being clear on what are the risks that might be involved in the particular experiment, who's directly impacted. It might be just the team. It may be others that work closely with the team. Who needs to be informed? What are some of the assumptions around this? Maybe there's a few small pilot experiments and who's keeping an eye on those? Ideally not the same person. And also, once you had that time to reflect, what are the insights? And as you can see, this is Creative Commons, so you can go ahead and even grab this template if you want to. But I think the most important thing is make sure that the people who are impacted by the experiment are included in setting up the experiment. Just don't impose an experiment on somebody because nobody wants to be a lab rat. So experiment with them and not on them, okay? So we've talked about what is a mind shift. We've talked about these three disciplines for leading the teams through this, and in particular, how we can experiment to explore these mind shifts and find a new status quo that hopefully is better for everybody. And I usually get asked this question in every talk I give on remote teams, so I just want to answer it now. My three favorite online tools, and they're very important for this particular time period, is patience, empathy, and listening. Those will get you through more change than anything else these days. So I'm now open for questions if you have any others, and there's my contact information on here as well. And I see a couple questions popping up here. So James said, do you assign an owner to managing the team's time? Maybe. It depends on the team. So if it's a team that is very well self-managed, I might ask somebody on the team to do that. If it is a team that is not used to controlling their time, I might have somebody take on a coaching role and ask them, bring in that hours of overlap chart that we had and might say, what might work better? What could we shift, or who can make some shifts, and not dramatic shifts so that somebody's up super early in the morning or super late at night. So that just depends on how much team or how much experience the team has with controlling their time. And I'm guessing Jens asked, do you encourage stable teams? Yes, for a period of time. So I'm also a big fan of Heidi Helfland's work. She has actually the second edition of her book, Dynamic Reteaming, is coming out, which will tell you quite a bit about when you want stable teams and when you might change up those teams. So with my remote teams, I had some teams that stayed together for 2 years, and some that would change based on not just the work coming up, but the interest of the work. Because remember, I talked about learning the whole person. If you also can understand what is it that's important to them professionally, what are they, maybe some new skills they want to pick up, and does some of the new work allow them to do more of that? That keeps them far more engaged with the work, far more engaged with the team. So have some flexibility in them shifting teams. And if you have one person leaving a team or adding to a team, you really have a new team. And you might want to revisit some of the working agreements around that. Let's see, and say, I often see distributed team members working on one story each and encourage them to swarm over same stories and thereby force, or I would say encourage, cross training. Yes. So some teams do that well, some not always. Again, it kind of depends on the culture of the organization. If there's still sort of an efficiency mindset, you might want to at least encourage pairing rather than everyone gets their own story, because those of us that have been doing Agile a long time, we realize that one person, one story approach rarely works well. There's a lot of knowledge exchange lost that could be shared across the team. And having that knowledge sharing really makes the whole team resilient. And if you can occasionally switch up the teams, do some of that dynamic reteaming, you spread the knowledge across the organization. That's the other advantage I found, to kind of go back to some of the other questions there. Any suggestions on some fun team building ideas for virtual teams? Oh man, there's a ton. So what I would recommend is a colleague of mine has far more of that than I do. So if you go to collaborationsuperpowers.com, Lizette Sutherland's site, she's somebody I collaborate with a lot. Let me put that in here, superpowers.com. She has a long list of resources with many fun team building ideas. Um, one, one that I tend to use quite a bit, and it is on my site, is called the Compass activity. It allows people to get a better understanding of their work preferences. So just as a short idea, uh, if you're in the north, you tend to jump into action all the time. If you're on the east, you tend to want the big picture before you move into action. If you're in the west, you want all the details. And if you're in the south, you want to hear everybody's input before the team moves forward. So by understanding kind of where you are on the compass and where each individual is, you can have some very useful conversations around working agreements just around those preferences. And I find it works far better than Myers-Briggs or Strength Finder or anything like that, which usually requires uh, way more digging into the model than that. So, all right, any other questions? All right.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Mark, so much. That was a great presentation and so appropriate for the times we're living in now, for sure. While you guys are still thinking about whether you have some more questions, I am going to launch a really quick poll for you to just answer a couple questions. And again, we really appreciate the time that you all have spent out of your day to join us and would love your feedback. So I'm going to launch that poll right now. give folks just a couple, about 30 seconds more. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Perfect. Awesome. And I captured a screenshot of that as well, Mark, for you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions before we kind of wrap it up for today? No? Awesome. Well, again, thank you all for taking the time to spend with us this afternoon, and a big thanks to Mark Kilby for his presentation. Thank you again. And
Thanks.
everybody have a great day, and I know it's a little early yet, but a wonderful weekend.
Be safe out there.
Yes, definitely.
Cheers, everybody. Great to be here.
Bye.
Good to see you, Kara.
You too.